All right. So, last week we were looking at Ephesians chapter 5, Paul's reminder to put God first, to love God above all else, because worship is about what we love, and it's about the order in which we love things. And we talked about redefining idolatry and sin as really not so much about individual bad things we do, but about having our loves out of order, giving too much attention and love to the things that don't deserve it or just don't deserve it as much. During his ministry, Jesus confronted many people who gave too much attention, too much love to the wrong things. And in particular, the people that he keeps running up against are these religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who we're going to talk about in a minute. And they're always putting their laws, their traditions, their own ideas, their own comfort ahead of what God really wants, of actually worshiping God, caring for their neighbors, all of that. One encounter like that is found in our passage for tonight, which is Luke chapter 20, verses 27 through 38, the entirety of which is in your bulletin, or you can find it in a Bible. But we're going to read from Luke chapter 20, verses 27 through 38. Some of the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus with a question. "Teacher," they said, "Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first one married a woman, died childless. The second and then the third married her, and in the same way, all the 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died also. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her?" Jesus replied, "The people of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and they can no longer die, for they are like the angels. They are God's children, since they are children of the resurrection. But in the account of the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise, for he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive." Before we get into sort of the meat and the meaning of this passage, it's probably best to explain some confusing things in here. First, Luke introduces us to a group called the Sadducees, who I briefly mentioned beforehand. The Gospels introduce us to a lot of different groups of Jews, different Jewish sects in the time of Jesus, during that time. There's the most famous, probably the one we run into the most in the Bible, is the Pharisees. They're religious leaders. Their big thing was strict adherence to the law of Moses, so strict that they added more laws to clarify the other laws, just kept adding on. On the other end of the spectrum from the Sadducees, as we'll see in a minute, were people like the Zealots, which was a group, essentially a catch-all term for people who did not like Rome, did not like Herod, did not like the government of the time, political revolutionaries, Zealots. And then there's a couple others who are kind of here and out, but the last big group is the Sadducees, who are in our passage tonight. They're a different faction within the Jewish religious leadership. So Pharisees are religious leaders, Sadducees also religious leaders, and these guys are the ones who are cozy with Rome and with Herod. They're totally cool with the way things currently are because things are good for them. There's sort of a classic joke you tell kids when you're talking about the Sadducees, which is, and it comes from this passage, which is the Sadducees were sad, you see, because they did not believe in a resurrection, which is just a stupid little pun. But it wasn't true. It's not true. These guys didn't believe in a resurrection, but they weren't sad about it. They were perfectly happy to not believe in a resurrection because they come from, honestly, an older school of thought than the Pharisees and others who believed in a resurrection. You see, in the ancient world, Some cultures did believe in an afterlife, some kind of something. But the Jews and many cultures around them in that area did not. You lived on through your descendants. You lived on through the material wealth and the blessings that you had gathered through and having many children and things of that nature. And so if your children, your grandchildren are wealthy and prosperous, you're blessed, it reflects well on you, you live on through them. You live on through your progeny. And that was just what everybody thought. If you look back in the Old Testament, there are sort of some hints of something else, but that seems to be sort of the dominant, what many people thought. But in the centuries leading up to Jesus, some people, including the Pharisees, started to sort of look at the prophecies in the Old Testament and some of the stories, and they started to realize, I think God was telling us that there's something more. I think there's more to the story than just we die and we live on through. And so even though it's not necessarily clear in the Old Testament, by the time we get to Jesus, the Pharisees and many other Jewish people now believe in life after death, in something like a resurrection of the dead at the end of all time, that everybody will live with God. And so we usually think of the Pharisees as kind of wrong about everything, right? That's how they're portrayed in the Gospels most of the time. In this one case, they actually took the right side of an argument. They weren't right very often, but they got this one right. The Sadducees kind of clung to the old view of afterlife. And it made sense for them to do so because they were rich and powerful. If anybody was blessed with living on through their children, their grandchildren, it was going to be them. They had that sort of prosperousness. They had that kind of life. And so they denied any kind of other afterlife. And we know that the Pharisees didn't like Jesus. But what about the Sadducees? They don't come up nearly as much. Well, they didn't like Jesus either. It's one of the very few things that the Pharisees and the Sadducees agreed on, actually. They were at odds a lot. But one of the things they did agree on was that Jesus has got to go. And for the Pharisees, it was because Jesus kept, disobeying the laws or reframing the laws and outright attacking them, right? Calling them, brood of vipers and whitewashed tombs and all kinds of fun things. The Sadducees don't come in for nearly as much direct attack from Jesus, but he sort of attacks their entire way of life. You have to imagine people are starting to call Jesus the Messiah. And the Messiah, we tend to think of it one way because we only think of it in context with Jesus. But for the Jews of the day, the idea of a Messiah was somebody who was going to come and free them from Rome, reestablish the Jewish kingdom, and be the king of the Jews, separate from Rome, get rid of Herod, all the powerful people. And as I already mentioned, the Sadducees really were totally cool with the powerful people because they were benefiting from it. These were the guys who were in cahoots. So if Jesus is anything like what the people are saying he is, and what he himself seems to be claiming to be, then the Sadducees would, in fact, be sad, you see. And so we come to our story in Luke chapter 20. A group of Sadducees approaching Jesus with a question about the resurrection. We already know they don't believe in the resurrection. Their goal, so far as I can tell, is to try and discredit Jesus and the resurrection simultaneously by trapping Jesus in some kind of logical paradox, get him confused about the resurrection, get him to say something that doesn't make sense, something they can make fun of him for, and at the same time, make fun of the resurrection and people who believe in it. I don't see any other reason why they would be trying to do this, because it doesn't work out very well for them. Now, one more thing we have to talk about before we actually get into the meat of it. To understand their question, we have to kind of shed some of our 21st century lenses for just a sec. Because in our minds, the idea of a woman marrying 7 men who are all brothers seems gross at the very best. But in the ancient world, marrying your brother's widow was, in fact, about the legacy of your brother. It ties back to what we were talking about earlier, about how you lived on, right? How you lived on if there was no life after death, no resurrection. Because a man who dies with no children is effectively erased. That's it. That's the end of your line. You are gone. But in the Jewish law, it was established that if a brother marries the widow and has children with her, the firstborn is considered the child of the deceased brother. And so that child sort of carries on in spirit the line of the deceased family member. And so you're in a sense, you're sort of saving them, right, from eternally disappearing from the earth. You're helping carry on their line. I know it sounds very different to us today, very strange, but it was a way of preserving and honoring your family, your relatives. So that's one difference. The other difference, big difference, that we need to be aware of is that obviously in those times, the idea of an independent woman was completely unheard of. We might be inclined to ask, after having read that parable, like, why the woman would need to belong to any one of them at all, but that question would not have even occurred to our Sadducees, anybody in that time. They thought the woman must belong to one of these men. I mean, that was just taken for granted for them. And since none of them gave her children, none of those 7 brothers can lay a particular claim on her as the one who carried on her lineage either, because in the same way, her lineage has also died out now. So in the minds of the Sadducees, what they've done is offered a paradox about the resurrection, an insoluble problem that they're hoping will trap Jesus into making a fool of himself. But Jesus is not drawn into their trap. First, he answers by declaring that in the resurrection, people will not marry or be given in marriage. And I think you can hopefully see after what we just said that to the Pharisees, or the Sadducees especially, but to everybody, that would be shocking. It would be a shocking thing to say. To suggest that there might be women in this resurrection who are independent of a husband is to suggest a level of equality between men and women that would be a radical departure from anything the Jews had conceived in the past, or up to that point. But more importantly than that, Jesus completely reframes their whole understanding of the resurrection. He very quickly just sort of dismisses the absurdity of their question. He doesn't give an answer besides just like, it doesn't matter, it's not going to happen. And then Jesus goes one step further beyond just dismissing it, and he directly attacks the Sadducees by declaring that everyone is part of the resurrection. Not only is life after death not about material rewards, but Jesus declares that God is not the God of the dead, but the living. And to God, everyone is alive. Now, that's a statement that we might need to sit with for a bit. If everyone is alive to God, if no one truly dies, then not even when people pass away on the earth can we talk about somebody not existing. That's why God can still be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they're still alive to God somehow. Jesus is going way further than just acknowledging the resurrection. The debate in those days may have been about the existence of a resurrection, but what did that mean to them? We don't know exactly what they thought that meant. That someday everybody would be alive again, that seems to be the leading theory. They all thought at the end of things everyone would be alive with God. Perhaps for some of them, they just were thinking about an afterlife in general. Honestly, we don't know, and none of them knew either. They had kind of started to figure out that God was sharing something beyond just this life with them, but they still didn't know. And that's one of the things that Jesus reveals is a bit more about what that was like. And what Jesus is saying here is that no one ever truly dies. God is the God of the living. That's beyond what the Sadducees could possibly have expected. Not only that, but by saying that God is the God of the living, Jesus rearranges the Sadducees' whole understanding of life. Remember, these guys believed in no resurrection because they had it good. It was easy for them to not need any kind of resurrection. God blessed them in this life, so they'll live on in the blessings that they leave to their descendants. And in one sense, you'd think that saying that God is the God of the living sounds like it would fit perfectly into their view. Once you're dead, you're done. God continues to care for the living. But if even Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are considered among the living, and remember, these guys have been gone for a long time, if even that's true, then God being the God of the living means something about how we must live today, right now. Because our current life doesn't end or get passed on to our kids, but keeps on going after death on this earth. Abraham died, his material possessions passed on to Isaac, but Abraham didn't just live on in Isaac. He lived on himself in God's presence somehow. That's what Jesus is saying. And so suddenly, these material blessings that the Sadducees have accumulated, they don't mean anything. They're going to get passed on to their descendants, but they're not just going to cease to exist and live on through their kids. There's something else for them. If God is the God of the living, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are included in that, then the Sadducees' money cannot save them. Their material blessings, their worldly blessings cannot save them. It does not represent God's eternal blessing. And so when Jesus says that God is the God of the living, it should give us both hope and force us to examine how we're living right now. We have hope because we know that death is not the end. There's a resurrection, there's a life after death. This passage doesn't tell us much about that afterlife. Jesus kind of, like I said, he dismisses the Sadducee story without really addressing it too much. But it does tell us loud and clear that the afterlife does exist. And that in that afterlife, we will be far more interested in what God is doing than in any of our old human relationships. And so we should live with hope, not despair, right? The Sadducees lived on through the children. The option for us today, if we were to take a Sadducee-like approach, would be nihilism, nihilistic despair, because this life would be seen as the end. That would be it. You might as well do what you want. But there's no need for that sort of nihilistic despair, because this life is not the end. We can live in hope. But at the same time, this life still matters. Because God is the God of the living, that doesn't just speak to being alive after death. It also speaks to the fact that God is the God of us right now. So this life is not a test. It's not just biding time until the resurrection. Like the Sadducees, we can fall into complacence, feeling as though our lives are pretty good sometimes, that our blessings are proof of something. But because God is the God of the living, we need to live as though this life, the one we have now, will continue forever. There's no magic reset button that is going to make us perfect people when we die. Now again, we don't know what happens after we die, but we're called to a life of service to God now, today. We can't wait for some future when we're different, better people. When we live with that reality, and then we add to it the hope of grace and life with God, we approach something like the life that I think God really wants for us. Not selfish nihilism, like the Sadducees, but one of virtuous hope, where our lives matter today, tomorrow, and forever. So let's give thanks to the God of the living and join together in prayer.